In a world often driven by assumptions and prejudice, one young boy's simple act of kindness forces an entire community and one wealthy businessman to confront their biases head-on. This is a story of humanity, bravery, and how one decision can change the course of a life. Malik shivered as he walked down the snow-covered sidewalk, his breath visible in the freezing air. The city's cold seemed to press against him, sinking deep into his bones, but he was used to it. He had spent too many nights curled up beneath park benches and abandoned doorways to complain. His thin blue long-sleeve shirt barely provided warmth, and his black backpack, his only possession, hung loosely over his shoulders. The streets were quiet tonight, the usual rush of cars and chatter replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of his footsteps against the icy pavement. His stomach rumbled, but Malik ignored it. Hunger was just another thing he had learned to push aside. He was used to walking these streets alone, unnoticed by the world around him. People walked past him every day, their eyes either filled with pity or completely indifferent. He had long since stopped expecting kindness from strangers. As he walked past an alleyway, something unusual made him pause. A faint cry, soft and desperate, carried through the wind. At first, he thought he was imagining it, another trick of exhaustion. But then it came again, clearer this time. A baby's cry. His pulse quickened. He hesitated for a moment, his breath hitching as he turned toward the dark alley. The dim glow of a streetlight barely illuminated the area, casting long shadows against the brick walls. A pile of trash bags was stacked against the dumpster, but beneath them there was movement. The sound of whimpering, weak but persistent. Malik's heart pounded as he stepped forward cautiously, pushing aside some of the bags, and then he saw it, a tiny bundle wrapped in nothing but a thin, dirty cloth. A baby. Its face was red from the cold, its small hands trembling. Malik's body moved before his mind could catch up. He reached down, gently lifting the infant into his arms. The baby's skin was freezing against his fingers, and he quickly pulled the bundle closer to his chest, trying to give it some warmth. "Hey, shh," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had just found. Who would do this? Who could leave a baby out here in the middle of winter alone and helpless? He looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could tell him this was a mistake, that the child wasn't abandoned. But the alley was empty. The only sound was the wind howling through the buildings, a cruel reminder of how merciless the night could be. Malik swallowed hard, realizing that no one was coming. It was just him and the baby. His mind raced with what to do next. He had never taken care of a child before. He barely knew how to take care of himself. But one thing was certain. He couldn't leave the baby here. His grip tightened around the small bundle as he stepped back onto the sidewalk. The snow fell heavier now, dusting his hair and shoulders. He knew he had to find help, but the question was, who would listen to him? He had learned the hard way that people rarely stopped for kids like him, let alone believed them. His feet carried him forward instinctively, even as doubt clawed at his mind. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay still. The baby whimpered again, and Malik pressed his lips together, determined. He had spent years being invisible, but tonight he would make sure someone saw him. Someone had to listen, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about saving a life. Malik's life had never been easy. For as long as he could remember, he had been on his own, navigating the unforgiving streets with nothing but his instincts and sheer will to survive. Homelessness had become his reality, shaping him into someone who knew how to adapt, how to find shelter when the nights grew too cold, and how to scavenge for food when his stomach ached from hunger. He had learned to read people, to know who would offer a kind word and who would rather pretend he didn't exist. Despite the hardships, Malik never let the world harden him. He had seen cruelty, felt the sting of rejection, but he still held on to something rare: kindness. It wasn't that he expected anything in return. He just knew what it felt like to be ignored, to be invisible. And he never wanted anyone else, not even a stranger, to feel the same way. That was why, even though his hands were freezing and his own body shivered from the cold, he held the baby close, determined to keep it warm. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't let this child suffer the way he had. He wasn't sure why the baby had been left in the dumpster, but he didn't need to understand to know what he had to do. What he didn't know was that this wasn't just any child. This was a baby that belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the city, the Harrisons. Charles Harrison was a name everyone knew. He wasn't just rich, he was powerful. The kind of man whose mere presence commanded attention, whose influence stretched into politics, business, and even the media. He had built an empire from the ground up, and he took pride in the belief that he was superior to those who hadn't worked as hard as he had. But his version of hard work had come with privilege, something he refused to acknowledge. He viewed people like Malik as nothing more than a problem, lazy, dangerous, and unworthy of his concern. His wife, Eleanor, had once been a woman of warmth, but years of living under Charles' cold, unyielding rule had molded her into someone distant, someone who followed his lead without question. They lived in a world where appearances mattered more than emotions, where status determined one's worth. They had one child, a baby girl, but to Charles, having a daughter was merely a formality, an heir to carry on his name. He had never once held her in his arms, never once felt the weight of responsibility beyond ensuring she had the best life money could buy. But money couldn't buy what was about to happen. Malik, unaware of the powerful people connected to the child in his arms, pressed forward, each step carrying the weight of uncertainty. The baby whimpered softly against his chest, its tiny fists clenching as if grasping for comfort. Malik didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he had found this child for a reason, and he wasn't going to turn his back on it. What he didn't realize was that his decision to protect this baby would soon place him directly in the path of Charles Harrison, a man who had spent his entire life looking down on people like Malik. But tonight, their worlds were about to collide, and neither of them would ever be the same again. Malik hadn't planned on being a hero that night. He was just trying to get through another cold evening, searching for a place to rest before the frost crept too deep into his bones. But fate had other plans. As he walked past a dimly lit alley, something unusual caught his attention, a faint cry, weak but persistent. It was a sound that didn't belong to the night's usual noises of the city. He stopped, listening, his heart pounding as he moved closer. And then he saw it. Near the dumpster, wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth, lay a tiny baby. Malik's breath hitched. He glanced around, hoping, praying that someone else had seen this. But the street was empty. Whoever had left this child had done so without care, without a second thought. Kneeling beside the infant, Malik hesitated only for a second before carefully scooping the baby into his arms. The child whimpered, its body trembling from the cold. Malik knew that if he didn't act fast, the baby wouldn't make it through the night. He pulled off his own hoodie, wrapping the child in it, shielding it as best he could. But where could he go? Malik started walking, the baby held close to his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. He passed people on the sidewalk, his eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to stop and help. But the stares he received were not of concern, only suspicion. A woman clutched her purse tighter as he passed. A man shook his head disapprovingly. A store owner, standing outside locking up for the night, eyed Malik and the baby warily before turning away. No one asked if he needed help. No one asked why he, a boy barely old enough to fend for himself, was carrying a newborn in the freezing cold. Malik's stomach churned, but he pressed forward. He knew he had to find help, even if no one was willing to give it. Spotting a convenience store up ahead, he hurried inside, the warmth hitting his face like a wave of relief. The clerk behind the counter looked up, his expression immediately changing to one of suspicion. "Hey, kid," the man barked. "What are you doing in here?" Malik swallowed hard. "Please, sir, I found this baby. She needs help. I just need to call someone." But before he could finish, the clerk frowned, stepping around the counter. "You need to leave," he said sharply. "I'm not dealing with this tonight." Malik's grip on the baby tightened. "Please," he tried again. "I don't want money. I don't want anything. I just—" The man took another step forward, his voice rising. "I said get out." For a moment, Malik thought about pleading one more time. But he could see it in the man's face. There would be no kindness here. No one would listen. So, with his heart sinking, he turned and left. The wind hit him as he stepped back onto the street, the cold biting even harder now. The baby stirred against his chest, a small, fragile thing that depended on him. Malik gritted his teeth and kept moving. Then he saw it. A police station up ahead, its lights glowing like a beacon. His pace quickened, his legs shaking as he stepped inside. The warmth of the station washed over him, but the moment was short-lived. A tall officer behind the front desk glanced up, his expression immediately unreadable. "What's this?" Malik hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I found this baby," he said, voice steady. "Someone left her outside. I brought her here because she needs help." The officer's brow furrowed. His eyes scanned Malik from head to toe, lingering on his ragged clothes and the dirt on his hands. "You found the baby," the officer repeated, skepticism dripping from his tone. "Yes, sir," Malik said, nodding. "She was left near the dumpster. She's cold, and I think she's sick. Please, she needs a doctor." The officer exchanged a glance with another officer nearby. Then, instead of calling for medical help, he crossed his arms. "And why should I believe you?" Malik's chest tightened. "Because it's the truth." The officer sighed, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe some kid off the street. You could have taken this baby for all I know." Malik's stomach dropped. "No, Where are her parents?" the officer pressed. "I don't know." The officer scoffed. "Convenient." Malik's hands trembled, but he kept his head up. "I didn't do anything wrong." The baby, as if sensing the tension, let out a small cry. The sound seemed to echo in the station, filling the silence. Malik looked down at her, then back at the officer. "She needs help," he said again, quieter this time. For a moment, the officer just stared at him. Then, with a sigh, he picked up the phone and made a call. Malik didn't relax, not yet. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to them to listen. He just hoped that for once, someone finally would. The police station doors swung open with a forceful gust of wind as Charles Harrison stepped inside. his presence demanding attention. A tall man in a sleek black coat, his piercing blue eyes swept the room with an air of authority. His expression was unreadable, but beneath the surface, impatience and irritation simmered. He hadn't been told much, only that a baby had been found, and it somehow involved the police. He strode past the officers, ignoring their nods of acknowledgement until his gaze landed on Malik. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This the kid?" he asked, his voice cold, detached. The officer beside him nodded. "He's the one who found the baby." Harrison exhaled sharply, his stare fixating on the boy. He took in Malik's appearance, the oversized clothes, the backpack slung over his shoulder, the wary but unwavering posture. Everything about Malik screamed trouble to him. His fingers clenched around his gloves. "Where is she?" Malik, standing tall despite the older man's scrutinizing gaze, carefully adjusted the baby in his arms before stepping forward. Without hesitation, he extended the bundled child toward Harrison. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Harrison hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed he'd find chaos, some absurd misunderstanding, but not this. This boy standing before him with the weight of responsibility in his young hands. He reached out, his movements uncharacteristically slow, as if the moment itself was too fragile to disturb. As soon as his fingers touched the baby's small frame, something inside him shifted. His breath caught in his throat. The tiny features, the delicate nose, the soft rise and fall of her chest. It was unmistakable. His heartbeat thundered as his eyes darted toward the bag hanging loosely from Malik's arm. With shaky hands he pulled it open, and there, lying neatly inside, was a small envelope. His fingers trembled as he pulled out a folded piece of paper, a birth certificate. His breath faltered as he read the name. It was her, his granddaughter. His world tilted. The realization crashed over him like an unforgiving wave. This wasn't just some abandoned baby. This was his blood, his family. And the boy standing before him, the one he had immediately judged, was the very person who had saved her life. Harrison's grip on the birth certificate tightened. His mind raced. How had it come to this? How had his own kin been left to die, only to be rescued by a child whom society had cast aside? His gaze lifted to meet Malik's eyes. The boy stood silently, his face calm but unreadable, waiting. He wasn't expecting a reward. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He had done what needed to be done, with no expectation beyond the baby's safety. For the first time in his life, Charles Harrison felt truly small. He swallowed hard, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. You saved her." Malik simply nodded. Harrison turned away for a moment, glancing down at the infant now safely nestled in his arms. His granddaughter, a child who could have been lost forever. He looked back at Malik, and in that instant, everything shifted. His entire life, he had believed in division, rich versus poor, privilege versus struggle. He had built walls, erected barriers in his mind to keep people like Malik out of his world. But now, that wall had crumbled with a single act of kindness. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. Clearing his throat, he adjusted his coat and inhaled deeply before turning fully to the boy. "Where are your parents?" Malik blinked, caught off guard. He hesitated before answering, "I don't have any." Something inside Harrison cracked. The man who had built an empire, who had defined his existence by wealth and power, now stood before a boy who had nothing, yet had given more than most men ever would. A decision formed in his mind. A bold, unexpected decision. His fingers curled tighter around the baby, And then after a long pause, he spoke words that stunned everyone in the room. "Come with me." Malik's brows furrowed. "What?" Harrison cleared his throat. "I want you to come with me. I want to adopt you." The words hung in the air, thick with emotion. The officers behind them exchanged stunned glances. Even Malik remained silent, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. Charles Harrison, a man defined by his prejudices, was offering this boy a home. It was a moment that neither of them had expected, and yet somehow it felt right. The quiet hum of the police station had faded, replaced by the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Malik stood motionless, his mind racing. The man before him, Charles Harrison, a man of wealth and power, had just offered him something he had never known: a home. For years, Malik had wandered the streets, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers. He had never expected anything in return for his good deeds. Helping the baby had been instinctual. He hadn't done it for recognition, and certainly not for reward. Yet here he was, facing a choice that could change the entire course of his life. Harrison's expression was unreadable, though there was something different in his eyes now, a softness that hadn't been there before. It was as if, for the first time, he truly saw Malik, not just as a homeless boy, but as a person, a child who had saved his granddaughter's life, a boy who had done what so many others wouldn't have. Malik hesitated, his fingers curling into the fabric of his worn-out sleeves. "Why?" His voice was quiet, cautious. Harrison exhaled, shifting the baby slightly in his arms. He looked down at her, then back at Malik. "Because I was wrong," he admitted, his voice lacking the coldness it once carried. "Because I judged you before I knew you, and because no child should have to survive the way you have." The words hit Malik harder than he expected. He had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like an inconvenience. Now, someone was acknowledging what he had endured, what he had fought against every single day. The officers in the station remained silent, watching as something profound unfolded before them. Even they knew this moment carried weight beyond what any report could capture. Malik took a slow breath, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe this was real, that this wasn't just another cruel joke life had decided to play on him. But something in Harrison's tone, in his stance, told him that this wasn't just a moment of guilt. It was something deeper. For the first time, the barriers between them, class, race, status, didn't seem so impenetrable. Harrison extended his free hand. "Come with me," he said again, this time softer. "Let's change both our lives." Malik looked at the man's hand, then at the baby, who had finally calmed, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of his sleeve. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, the hunger, the cold. He thought of what it would mean to finally belong somewhere. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out. The moment their hands met, the story they had started was no longer about a lost child or an abandoned baby. It was about breaking cycles. It was about changing perspectives. It was about proving that kindness had the power to transcend even the deepest prejudices. As they walked out of the station together, the officers murmured amongst themselves, some in disbelief, others in quiet admiration. The world outside was still the same, cold, indifferent, but something between them had shifted. For Malik, this wasn't just about being saved. It was about proving that he had always been worthy. For Harrison, this wasn't just about redemption. It was about learning what true humanity looked like. And for everyone watching, it was a reminder that sometimes the people we least expect can teach us the most valuable lessons of all. Because in the end, it wasn't wealth or power that defined a person. It was the courage to do what was right. And Malik had always had that courage.